My mother was standing in the kitchen where she had packed my school lunches for 12 years, and she said, with the specific calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment, "We were trying to protect you from making bad decisions." That was her explanation. For 2 years of my life being systematically destroyed. 8 people heard it. My father. My Aunt Carol. 2 cousins. A neighbor named Pat who had stopped by for coffee and didn't leave fast enough. Every one of them heard her say it. And not one of them knew that a CEO in Chicago had recorded her voice on a phone call 3 days earlier, and that I had the audio file on my phone, sitting in my jacket pocket, right there in that kitchen. My name is Jessica Miller. I am 30 years old. This is the story of how my own parents spent 2 years secretly calling every company I applied to and telling them I had a criminal fraud record, and how one man named Michael Reynolds handed me the proof that unraveled everything they had built. By the time my mother said those words, I had already accepted the job. They just didn't know what else I had accepted along with it. I grew up in Naperville, Illinois, in a house that looked warm from the outside and operated like a system from the inside. My parents, Frank and Sandra Miller, described themselves as a close family. What they meant was that the circle was carefully managed and the exit required permission they would never give. My father worked in municipal administration for 22 years, steady salary, nameplate on the desk, a parking spot he mentioned more than was necessary. He was not a loud man. He was a constant one. The kind of man who expressed control not through anger but through the slow, patient architecture of expectations. He had a way of summarizing you to other people at dinner tables, at family gatherings that left no room for a version of yourself he hadn't pre-approved. My mother was the one everyone called the family hub. The person who knew everything about everyone and made sure everyone knew she knew. She had friends who depended on her, relatives who deferred to her, and a need to be needed that had no visible floor. She was warm, genuinely warm, in the way that some controlling people are warm because the warmth is real, and so is the grip, and they have never seen a reason to separate the two. My brother Kevin was 3 years older, lived 4 blocks from my parents, worked in my father's office, and had dinner with them every Sunday without being asked. He was not obedient in a weak way, he was genuinely comfortable, genuinely present, genuinely theirs. He was the proof of what staying looked like. The template. And I had grown up understanding, without being told directly, that I was expected to become a variation of the same thing. I had not understood, until I was 30 years old, how far they were willing to go to make sure I did. I graduated from the University of Illinois in 2017, with a business degree. I had worked for scholarships, part-time jobs, a thesis that took 14 months, and 2 complete rewrites. I came home with that degree and started applying for positions in Chicago. Finance, operations, executive support. I was good in interviews. I knew this because the people interviewing me told me so, directly, with specificity. Hiring managers used phrases like "exactly what we're looking for," and "we'll be calling you very soon." And then they didn't call. The first rejection I explained as competition. The second as timing. By the 8th, I was overhauling my resume. By the 15th, I was questioning things about myself that had nothing to do with my resume. I started working part-time at Target to cover expenses. I told myself it was temporary. My parents, during this period, were present in a way that I now understand was strategic. My mother brought me tea when I was discouraged. My father said at family gatherings that I was still figuring things out gently, without cruelty, but consistently, as though it were simply a fact about my identity that everyone had accepted. My aunt nodded. My cousins changed the subject. Kevin said nothing because Kevin was never asked to say anything. He was the good outcome. I was the ongoing project. I spent nearly 3 years in that holding pattern. My savings went from $14,000 to $2,300. My confidence deteriorated in the specific way that happens when reality stops making sense, when you do everything right, and nothing responds the way it should. I began to believe the problem was invisible and internal, the kind that doesn't show up on paper but follows you into every room. I was half right about the invisible part. The first real warning I didn't recognize as a warning came in the fall of 2019. A consulting firm in Chicago. Final round interview. The hiring manager, a woman named Dana, had been direct and warm throughout the process. At the end of the final interview she said, "You're our top candidate. We'll be in touch by Friday." Friday came and went. I followed up. Dana's response was 3 lines: "Position filled internally, best of luck, hope we connect in the future." I accepted it. Competition was fierce. Things happened. I moved on. The second moment came in early 2020. A financial services firm downtown. 2 rounds, a skills assessment, a verbal indication from the recruiter that an offer was in preparation. Then 2 weeks of silence followed by a form rejection. I called the recruiter. She was vague and apologetic. She said something had come up in the reference process. She couldn't elaborate. I had 3 references. I called all 3 of them. None had been contacted. I stayed up that night running through every possibility. I landed on coincidence because it was the only explanation that didn't require me to believe something I wasn't ready to believe. The third moment was spring 2021. A marketing operations role in Evanston. The department head shook my hand at the end of the interview and said, "I think you're going to fit in really well here." 2 days later, a rejection with no explanation. I drove home from that interview and sat in my car in front of my parents' house for 25 minutes before going inside. I was not crying. I was trying to understand something I could feel, but not see a shape in the dark that kept moving when I reached for it. My mother brought me tea. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "I know this is hard. But maybe Chicago just isn't right for you yet. You're safe here. We love having you close." She reached over and covered my hand with hers. I said thank you. I drank the tea. I did not know, sitting at that table, that she had made a phone call to that firm in Evanston 4 days earlier. October 2022. I applied for an executive assistant position at Reynolds Capital Group in Chicago. The CEO, Michael Reynolds, conducted first-round interviews himself for senior adjacent roles. I prepared for 3 days, researched the company's structure, their recent acquisitions, their operational gaps. The interview lasted 47 minutes. Michael was precise and unhurried. He asked questions that required actual thinking. At the end he said, "You communicate clearly under pressure. I'll be in touch." 2 days later, my phone rang. Not HR, Michael Reynolds directly. His voice was measured. He said, "Jessica, I need to ask you something directly. Is there any reason someone would be calling employers and telling them you have a criminal fraud record?" The room tilted. That is the only accurate description. I was standing in my apartment and the room tilted, and I sat down on the floor without deciding to. I said, "No. I have no criminal record. Nothing. Not even a speeding ticket." He said he thought that was the case. Then he told me what had happened. 2 days after my interview, a woman had called his office. She identified herself as my mother. She told the receptionist she was calling as a courtesy to the company. She said I had a history of financial dishonesty. She said I had stolen from family members. She said I had a criminal background they should investigate carefully before moving forward. Michael had not dismissed it. He had asked his assistant to document everything and record any follow-up contact. Then he had made calls to a recruiter he knew at a firm I had previously applied to. That recruiter remembered a similar call. So did a contact at a second firm. This was not the first time. It had been happening for at least 2 years. He said he had the recording. He said he would send it to me. Then he said, "The job is yours if you want it." I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time after that call ended. I did not move because I needed a moment to understand what I was being asked to absorb. 2 years. Every interview where I had left feeling like this time would be different. Every rejection that had landed like a verdict on my abilities, my worth, my future. Every night I had spent revising my resume, rehearsing my answers, trying to find the flaw in myself that was causing this. There was no flaw. There was a phone call. There was my mother's voice, calm and purposeful, calling strangers to tell them her daughter was a criminal. I sat on that floor and I let myself feel the full weight of it. Not just the betrayal. The years. The specific cruelty of being the one who doubted yourself while the person destroying you brought you tea and told you that you were safe. I cried on that floor. Alone, for about an hour. Hard in the way that happens when something you didn't know you were holding finally releases. Then I stood up. I washed my face. I listened to the recording. Her voice was so calm. That was the part that finished something in me permanently. I called my friend Andrea at 9 that evening. Andrea was the one person who had been saying, for 2 years, that something didn't add up, that my interview feedback was too positive for the pattern of outcomes I was experiencing. I had dismissed her theory because I couldn't make myself believe it. Andrea said, "I know," and nothing else, and then she said, "What do you need?" I told her I needed to go to my parents' house tomorrow. She said she would be on the phone the entire drive if I needed her. I spent that night building the document. I pulled every application from the past 3 years, dates, companies, contact names, interview outcomes. I noted every firm where the reference process had been flagged, or where the explanation had been vague. I cross-referenced them against what I knew of my mother's routine, her access to my laptop when I'd left it open at their house, the occasions when I'd mentioned applications before I had submitted them. 8 companies. 2 years and 4 months. A pattern that was no longer a theory. Andrea's contact was a consumer protection and defamation attorney named David Park. I called his office at 8 the next morning. His assistant scheduled a same-day consultation when I mentioned the recording. I drove to my parents' house that afternoon with my phone in my jacket pocket and the recording queued. My father opened the door. He looked at my face and something shifted in his, not guilt, not yet, but recognition. The recognition of a man who has been waiting for a door to open and isn't sure which side he wants to be on when it does. My mother was in the kitchen. The lavender candle was burning. Coffee was made. It looked like every other Saturday morning I had spent in that house for 30 years. I stood in the kitchen doorway. I did not sit down. I asked one question. Why are you calling my employers and telling them I have a criminal record? My mother turned from the counter. Her expression did not break. She said, "I don't know what you're talking about." There it was. The first move. I said, "I have a recording." She said, "That's not possible." I said, "It was recorded by the CEO of the company." She said, "Then it's been taken out of context." My father said, quietly, "Sandra." She turned to him. "Frank, I am handling this." I pressed play. Her voice filled that kitchen. Measured. Helpful sounding. Telling a stranger that her daughter had stolen from family. That there was a criminal history. That they should look into it carefully for their own protection. The candle kept burning. The coffee maker made its small sound. 8 people in that house heard every word. My mother's face went through something I had never seen on it before, not guilt, not immediately, but the specific expression of a person watching a version of themselves they have always kept private become visible in a room full of witnesses. Her hands, which had been moving, went still on the counter. My father sat down at the kitchen table. He didn't look at the floor this time. He looked at me. His eyes were full and his jaw was tight, and he looked like a man understanding, in real time, the specific distance between what he had allowed and what he had told himself he was allowing. He said, "How long did you know?" I said, 3 days. He said, "How long was she doing it?" I said, at least 2 years. 8 companies. He put his face in his hands. My mother said, we were trying to protect you from making bad decisions. I looked at her. I said, I have a meeting with an attorney on Monday. I picked up my phone. I got my coat. I left. David Park spent 3 weeks building the case with precision. The recording was the centerpiece. The documented timeline, 8 applications, 8 suspicious outcomes, a clear pattern of interference formed the supporting structure. David identified claims under Illinois defamation law and tortious interference with prospective employment opportunity. The calculated damages, conservative and documented, covered lost wages across the interference period at my projected entry-level salary of $58,000 annually, approximately $19,600 per year, across 2.5 years, with multipliers for documented reputational harm. My parents retained a family attorney, a man named Gerald Walsh, who had handled their estate planning, and clearly had not expected to be managing a defamation defense for them. There were 6 weeks of formal correspondence, 2 attempted mediations, and 1 session where my mother's attorney presented a counter-narrative that the calls had been made out of genuine parental concern, that no malicious intent existed, that the harm was overstated. David put the recording on speaker in that mediation room. Gerald Walsh asked for a recess. The settlement was signed 8 weeks after I walked out of that kitchen. Written acknowledgement of the conduct. A formal letter of retraction available to affected parties. Financial settlement of $22,000. And a clause my attorney had insisted on: my parents were prohibited from making any further contact with my current or future employers. My father called me the evening before they signed. He said, I knew something was wrong. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere with her. He paused. That's not a reason. I know it's not a reason. I told him I understood the difference between a reason and an excuse. He said he did too. That was the most honest conversation we had ever had. It lasted 9 minutes, and it will stay with me longer than most things. My mother did not call before they signed. She called 6 weeks after, on a Tuesday evening. She said she had been talking to someone, a therapist, she said, which surprised me. She said she had spent her whole life needing to be the person people couldn't manage without. She said she had watched me become incapable of leaving, and she had not known what to do with that fear except act on it. She said she was sorry. She said it 3 times, slowly, like she was making sure each one landed separately. I listened to all of it. I said, I appreciate you saying that. I meant it. I also meant that appreciation and trust are different things, and that I would be determining the pace of whatever came next. Kevin called me 2 weeks after the settlement. He said he had known, for years, that our parents managed things, he just hadn't known how far it had gone. He said he was ashamed he hadn't looked closer. He said that staying close had felt like loyalty, and he was beginning to understand it had also been a kind of permission. I told him that was an important thing to say, and that I respected him for saying it. We have talked 4 times since. Each conversation has been a little more honest than the last. I think we are slowly finding out who we are to each other outside of the system we grew up in. My Aunt Carol, who was in that kitchen, sent me a card 3 weeks after the settlement. She said she had replayed that morning many times. She said she wished she had spoken up sooner about things she had noticed over the years. I wrote back and told her that speaking up now still counted. I live in Chicago. My apartment has 2 windows and a kitchen I cook in on Sundays. My salary is $71,000. My performance review at 6 months used the word exceptional. I have an office with a window that gets good afternoon light. I lost 2 years. I lost the version of my parents I had needed them to be. I lost the particular foundation of believing that the people who raised you are, at minimum, not the source of the wall you keep running into. I also lost the habit of turning the blame inward. That one I don't miss. What I gained is this: I know now that I was never the problem. The interviews went well because I was qualified. The jobs didn't come because the phone rang before I could get there. And the moment that stopped, the moment one man decided to tell me the truth instead of act on the lie, everything that had been blocked started moving. My mother needed me to need her. She built a version of me that couldn't leave, and she maintained it with a calm voice and a phone call, and the confidence that I would blame myself before I blamed her. She was right about that. For 2 years, she was completely right. Then Michael Reynolds answered his own phone. And I stopped looking inward for a problem that was never there. They gave me every reason to stay small. I kept the recording instead.